Well, good morning or evening or afternoon, wherever it is, whenever you are watching this. Looking at human rights today, Clooney calls on Australia to adopt new laws in the name of press freedom. This is an article by Rob Harris in the Sydney Morning Herald. It was on the 20th of April, 5:42. There's a picture of Rob. High-profile human rights lawyer Amal Clooney is lobbying the Australian government to adopt new laws, giving it the power to seize the assets of human rights offenders and ban them from entering the country. The Lebanese British barrister is leading an international panel of experts on press freedom, calling on governments to use Magnitsky-style sanctions against human rights offenders regimes, including those that imprison, murder, or intimidate journalists. So what on earth is happening here? Well, this is Amal Clooney. She's a well-known human rights advocate and lawyer. She married some actor guy, and she's pushing this Magnitsky style. What's a Magnitsky style? Well, basically, the US got in a spat with Russia over one of the journalists that was imprisoned. And in 2012, they passed a law that basically pinpointed a couple of individuals who were responsible in the regime and actually kind of put sanctions against them. They weren't allowed to travel. It froze a bunch of their financial assets overseas. So it's a much more targeted way of dealing with human rights abuses, which is quite interesting. Let's continue. It's after the journalist. The guy's name was Magnitsky. Let's continue. The Morrison government has initiated an inquiry into enacting legislation modelled on the US laws, which allow the imposition of visa and property-related sanctions on foreign individuals who are responsible for human rights violations. Ms. Clooney, the deputy chair of the high level of legal experts on media freedom, is set to appear via video link before Federal Parliament's Joint Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade next month, following her submission to the inquiry. Her joint submission with former President of the British Supreme Court, Lloyd Neuberger, said Australia's timely consideration of such laws was critical in stopping human rights abuses across the world. And this is quoting her. We believe that sanctions are a valuable enforcement tool for the protection of human rights and that it is time to use this tool to better protect journalists and free speech around the world, they say. So Australia has an important opportunity to lead with a new paradigm. It's a kind of like a set way of doing things. That where human rights are under attack, targeted sanctions will be a counterattack. The United States passed the Magnitsky Act in 2012, which was initially designed to sanction Russian officials involved in the prison death of Sergei Magnitsky, a Moscow lawyer investigating a sweeping tax fraud. Instead of broadly targeting an entire country, the sanctions target only select members of a regime, preventing them from traveling and from accessing bank accounts in Canada or the US. Canada, which along with fellow Five Eyes nation, so Five Eyes is the kind of five nations that are kind of setting up a kind of a security around the world. They've got a little pact there. Britain has since passed similar laws, has sanctioned people in the Russian and Venezuelan government, and sanctioned 17 people in Saudi Arabia in connection to the killing of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. American-born British financier and political activist Bill Browder was influential in the US adopting the laws, said in his submission Australia was at risk of becoming a magnet for dirty money from abusers and urged the adoption of the new laws. So basically what's happening here is we've got a couple of first world developed countries that have passed similar laws where they basically say, you are a member of a regime that has targeted journalists and we are going to sanction you. We're going to freeze passports, freeze assets, etc., to ensure that you cannot continue doing this and to kind of target and try and stop these abuses happening. So it's a counterattack. And why is he talking about us becoming a magnet for dirty money? Not because we're a particularly corrupt country, but often in third world or developing countries or in regimes which treat their citizens poorly, they will launder money by putting it into developed countries. So it's clean. So they'll find a way of making money in a corrupt way in their own country, and then they'll use means of getting that money to developed, clean, seen as less corrupt countries. And that's why he's saying we'll be a magnet for dirty money, because other countries have passed these laws, and if we don't, well, then they'll turn to another developed country which isn't seen as corrupt to put their money in. Labor Senator Kimberley Kitching, who is among a bipartisan group of MPs championing such laws, said Mr. Browder was due to give evidence to the committee in person, but the COVID-19 pandemic had made it impossible. She said he would give evidence by video conference and would hopefully be joined by Miss Clooney, Australian barrister Jeffrey Robertson, and former Canadian Attorney General Irwin Cotler, who had advocated for Magnitsky-style laws around the world. Okay, so some pretty high-profile people, especially Australian barrister Jeffrey Robertson. He carries a lot of clout when it comes to human rights. You know, the former Canadian Attorney General, once again, someone in a high position who's obviously advocated for this in his own country and in other countries. I have been in very regular contact with Bill Browder, the champion of global Magnitsky laws. It is a privilege to be able to discuss these advocates' experiences in helping to pass these laws around the globe, Senator Kitching said. The inquiry is one of a handful federal parliament has continued despite the spread of COVID-19, which all but shut down Canberra's Parliament House amid concerns around social distancing rules. Veteran MP Kevin Andrews, chair of the Human Rights Subcommittee of the Joint Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade, said it was important that the Australian government continues its work in these difficult times. This is important work and will be pressing on to deliver a report this year, he said. So what can we talk about when it comes to this? Well, here's the human rights syllabus. We're talking about themes here. The role of law reform in protecting human rights, most certainly. So this is obviously wanting to change or reform the law in order to make sure that journalists are protected. What about the changing understanding of the relationship between state sovereignty and human rights? Ordinarily, what would happen is you'd make a complaint to that country and you'd say, oi, this journalist has been treated badly. The Magnitsky-style sanctions go, no, we're actually going to be much more targeted and actually just pick a couple of individuals and sanction them. So it's kind of getting around state sovereignty. That's a really interesting understanding of it. Obviously, the idea of compliance and non-compliance in relation to human rights, free speech and journalists not having the right to free speech, and then the effectiveness of legal and non-legal measures in protecting human rights. I mean, it's really almost got everything, this topic. It's a brilliant example to talk about. Okay, so Amal Clooney, she's bringing the star power. I made the joke before about the actor. She's married to George Clooney. So she's got a really big kind of megaphone to talk about such things. So if we're looking at the actual dot points themselves, apart from the themes and challenges, the role of non-government organizations and the media in bringing this. So this is an organization, this panel of experts here. Okay, so it's not an intergovernmental organization or anything like that. They're getting together to push for it around the world. In Australia, the incorporation of human rights into domestic law, as well as statute law, which would be if they're passing that law. The committee is passing that law. And for issues, you're going to talk about limitations on free speech. So the idea of journalists being tortured, being imprisoned, etc., overseas, and these Magnitsky-style laws to put pressure on governments and on individuals within those regimes to stop doing what they're doing. Okay, so this is a brilliant study, a great article. Thank you, Rob Harris, to talk about it, and we'll see what happens in the future when this pops up again and we actually start to see some movement and see whether Australia passes these laws.